The battle for Raqqa is raging, and the US-backed coalition is closing in on the so-called Islamic State. But as its grip on the caliphate weakens, how will the terror group retaliate?
In the early years of the self-declared caliphate, the message was all about travelling out to Syria to help build the Islamic State. Now the message to supporters in the West is to stay away and attack the kuffar, the disbelievers, at home.
Good evening. For more than 3 years, the black flags of so-called Islamic State have cast a dark and bloody shadow across Iraq and Syria. But soon they might flutter their last. The end game is playing out in the battle for Raqqa, IS's de facto capital in Syria. Still, as the self-styled caliphate crumbles, there are fears that the group will increase its efforts to terrorise Europe's shores. And there are concerns about what might happen if its fighters return home. We can also talk about how IS control in Iraq and Syria has peaked in 2016. Well, since then, the collapse has been swift. The territory it controlled at the end of June this year has shrunk, and data from the Global Terrorism database at the University of Maryland show that between 2013 and 2016, there were 211 terror attacks outside Iraq and Syria by IS and IS-inspired individuals. And since 2013, 5 such attacks were here in the UK. And security sources say that in the last 4 years, they've foiled 18 attacks. And just tonight, police in Brussels said they were treating an attack on soldiers there as one of terror. A couple of hours ago in the UK, in London, a knife attack was reported by a man outside Buckingham Palace, leaving 2 police officers injured. The Metropolitan Police has said it's too early to know if it's terrorism. Either way, it shows that Britain is on high alert. And this all begs the question: if IS is finally weakened in Syria, where will it turn its attention to next? Richard Watson takes a look.
Slowly but surely, so-called Islamic State's caliphate is being destroyed in Syria and Iraq. IS is losing battle after battle on the ground. But it's too early to say it's lost the war, because as the state fails, it will continue in other forms.
It is a proto-state in Raqqa and Mosul and over those areas. It's also an insurgency across Syria and Iraq, and it's a terrorist movement to us here in the West. It occupies all of these 3 states simultaneously. Just because it's being pushed back as a state, that does nothing to resolve its other 2 dimensions.
So what does this mean for the UK terror threat? Around 850 jihadists from Britain have gone out to Syria to fight with IS. 15% have died. Half of the remainder, about 360, have already returned here, but many of these are early adopters and may pose a lesser threat.
People who went in 2012 were motivated by very different things to someone who went in 2015. The drivers of their radicalization, the pull, the allure was all very different. When we talk about returnees in the UK and the people who have come back, they're pretty much people who went earlier on.
Many of those still in Syria will want to stay and die fighting. And even if they did try to return, security sources have told Newsnight that MI5 knows the identities of most of the 850 British fighters who volunteered. So getting back into the UK undetected would be very difficult. Plus, Turkey and transit countries are cooperating with intelligence.
We know of one case of an individual with IS who did return to the UK, who used a land route. So he travelled through various countries by road, by car, and jumped on a ferry in the end and came across to the UK. When he did, the police had been monitoring him and tracking him the whole way across Europe. So as soon as he set foot on these shores, he was arrested, he's been convicted, he's serving a sentence right now in Belmarsh prison.
In Syria, IS's gradual defeat may actually spur supporters in the West to launch more low-tech attacks. Official security sources have told Newsnight there's been a marked shift in IS propaganda, and this now is a major threat against the UK. not from fighters physically returning from Syria. In the early years of the self-declared caliphate, the message was all about travelling out to Syria to help build the Islamic State. Now the message to supporters in the West is to stay away and attack the kuffar, the disbelievers, at home. The most recent attacks in Spain illustrate this well. The leader of the plot, a preacher, was blown up in the group's bomb factory. There's some evidence he spent time in prison with one of the terrorists responsible for the 2004 Al-Qaeda train bombings in Madrid. But there is no evidence yet of any direct link with Syria.
We have no evidence to prove that any of the attackers have been to the conflict area. Most of the attacks we've discovered in Catalonia and Spain in the last few years have been inspired by propaganda found online. But it's usually low-key incidents, mainly propaganda and small-scale terrorist financing or sending recruits to the caliphate.
So how do you stop low-tech attacks using trucks or knives? It's become much harder as the threat has diversified. In the decade after 9/11, Al-Qaeda plots were relatively sophisticated, planned over many months. There was a chain of command, networks to penetrate, communications to intercept. So is a shift in counter-terror tactics today required to combat the emerging threat across Europe?
It's important to tackle the threat at all stages, from the process of catching new recruits to Islamic State, dealing with self-starters who are attracted to their propaganda, and police techniques to detect and dismantle these extremist groups at an early stage.
Security sources here in the UK have told Newsnight that when intelligence does not meet the threshold for terrorist prosecutions, then they look for evidence of lesser crimes. Arrests are then made to disrupt networks and plots.
A lot of people, myself included, would like to see the authorities being far more disruptive in terms of arrests and prosecutions of people who are engaging with this material, who are engaging with spreading terrorist content, who are looking at that content and disseminating it online. There needs to be a much tougher and proactive legislative approach towards this, an arrest approach towards this.
One former counter-terrorism police officer told us that low-level crime often features in terrorist investigations. But he says the UK has preferred to run investigations long, with the aim of securing terrorist convictions.
We might find evidence of theft or credit card fraud or something like that, and we would disrupt them for that. So in terrorism, it's simply the same thing. It's just an organised criminal network, and for many years I've been saying I don't know why we don't go after them for other criminality.
Given that MI5 has 500 active investigations, 6 plots have been stopped since the Westminster Bridge attack in June, disruption by prosecuting for low-level offences is likely to become an increasingly vital tool.
Richard Watson there. So what of the hundreds of Britons who joined ISIS and are still in Syria? How worried should we be about the changing threat? Well, I'm joined now from Dubai by Ayman Dean, who's a former extremist who joined Al-Qaeda before leaving the group and becoming an informant for MI5. Also with me in the studio is Tasneem Akunji, who's a criminal lawyer who's specialised in terror cases. He represented the families of 3 schoolgirls from Bethnal Green who fled to Syria. What we know so far is one believed to be dead now and the fate of the other 2 unknown. Thank you for joining me, both of you gentlemen. Tasneem, you watched that report there. What do you think would motivate someone now, considering IS's caliphate shrinking and the state of its presence in Syria now? What would motivate someone to stay?
Well, a few things really. One is their inability to leave, really, is one of the things that would cause them to stay. They would, I would imagine, be concerned about what life, quote unquote, would be like should they return. So the prospect of coming back to a European country, wherever they may have originated from, knowing that they may well be detected, probably being aware that they're on the radar anyway, from interactions with the authorities and their families since they'd left, then it's not an attractive prospect. And also they have the problem of trying to get across a war zone into Turkey, whose shutters had come down some time ago in terms of the porousness of its borders. And they've had an active shoot-to-kill policy on the border of Turkey for over a year now. So there are very high hurdles for somebody to actually.
I mentioned that you've represented the 3 families of the girls from Bethnal Green. We understand, or the understanding is, that one may be dead, and it's not known the fate of the other 2. Do you think they, if they're alive, could be motivated to come home? What could motivate them to come home? Well,
in terms of Khadija Sultana, the girl who was reportedly killed, there was an active attempt to bring her back. She wanted to leave. The final straw that stopped her from actually engaging in that attempt was the brutal murder of a 16-year-old Austrian girl who had also tried to leave the week before. Now, she'd been caught and beaten to death publicly for that attempt, and that's what stopped Khadija from actually engaging in an attempt to leave.
Let's talk to Ayman. Ayman, you worked for Al-Qaeda between 1998 and 2006, and part of the currency which helped you come home was that you knew or had associations with Osama bin Laden. How easy was it for you to return?
Well, at the time it was easy because I was going out of Afghanistan for a medical treatment, and my intention basically was to leave because basically it was in the aftermath of the East Africa bombings. I decided that it wasn't a path I wanted to continue with, and during that medical leave, let's put it this way, I was then approached by MI6 at the time basically, and then I was persuaded to continue working for Al-Qaeda, but passing information back to London. So that's exactly what happened. It was more or less Al-Qaeda environment allowed me to go and allowed me to actually be able to leave. It wasn't as paranoid as ISIS right now.
We've been talking about the state of IS's control over Raqqa and how its caliphate might be weakened. In your mind, when you compare IS with Al-Qaeda, considering what Al-Qaeda was able to do in terms of terrorism, is IS as strong with or without a physical state?
Well, let us remember that between 2009 up until 2013, ISIS was, had no territory whatsoever. They were more or less an underground group armed with considerable amount of cash and a network of businesses dotted across Iraq, from Baghdad to Mosul to Ramadi and Diyala and other places. And they were able to use this network of businesses, including cafes and restaurants and farms and transportation companies, in order to infiltrate the security services and the government headquarters in Iraq. And then they were able then to use that as an intelligence gathering network, logistical support network. Then they took over quarter of the country in a lightning speed, using the fact that in neighboring country there was a civil war, which is Syria. So now, if they lose that territory, it doesn't matter because they have now considerable amount of cash as well as considerable business network in neighboring Turkey and in the Kurdish region in northern Iraq, as well as the fact that they have a network of sympathizers across the world, which they never had actually between 2009 and 2013. So now they are far even more greater threat actually than they were between 2009 and 2013.
Is Europe more at risk now that the state perhaps is weakening? We called it the end game in Raqqa, as it advises its followers, its supporters, to make damage or make terror where they are in Europe?
Well, since they lost the border with Turkey and the Turkish border became inaccessible to them in terms of smuggling people who are coming from Europe and other parts of the world, it became clear that they are telling would-be recruits, new potential recruits, to stay where they are in Europe, in Australia, in North America, and to wage jihad wherever they are. So the fact of the matter is that they themselves adopted this almost since 15 months ago, telling people to stay where they are and wage jihad where they are, because now ISIS is moving from being a proto-state into being a transnational terrorist organization.
I wonder what you think, Tasneem. Do you think you'll see more people, if people are being urged to stay in Europe, do you think there is also then that motivation for those, however difficult it is, to return?
Well, I think being urged to stay is just a soft power projection statement, really, by ISIS. It's suggesting that they have some control over the fact when they actually don't. People can't leave the UK.
Oh no, I mean to stay in Europe, and supporters stay in Europe, not go to Syria.
Oh, sure. Again, still a soft power issue in that if any attack happens inside of Europe, then ISIS will claim that it's on the basis that they made that edict, rather than the fact that physically they couldn't, the individual couldn't move. But more importantly than that, the reason why ISIS is more dangerous is not because it has a network, it's because it's now a franchise, a bit like Columbine. So if anyone wants to get news headlines, then all they have to do is do something which is crazy, pick up a knife or drive a car into somebody, which actually happens quite a lot. We have, you know, our prisons are filled with criminals, but to get front page on that, you just say you did it in the name of ISIS, really.
Tasneem Akunji, thank you very much. Eamon Dean as well, thank you for your time talking to us from Dubai.
Thank you.
Curfews are in place. Thousands of soldiers are on the streets in cities across 5 of India's northern states. This after violence erupted after the conviction of a well-known religious guru.